Rosie, that was fantastic. What an introduction. I'm going to be a letdown for sure. It's taken me a really long time to get here, so I'm really, really happy to be here. I've spent about 2 days in a haze absorbing the city. It's been fantastic. So I'm going to talk about the future of feminist theory as I'd like it to be, not as I think it might be. Okay. The last time I gave this paper, I had the hugest fight. I've only given it once before, and I had the hugest fight of my life. So I'm a little nervous giving this paper. It's quite provocative. I wanted to be provocative. I'd like people to think about the future of feminist theory. I think feminist theory has a future, and you are its future. It needs to be made into the future. So I want to provoke and stimulate the production of theory, and especially the production of theory oriented around central questions of feminism, as much as I possibly can. Provocation and enticement, I think, are the best way to induce the production of new thought. And that's really what I'd like to try and encourage as much as possible. I hope my Australian accent, which has no trace of American in it, I hope my Australian accent is understandable. Please let me know if you have difficulty hearing me or understanding. And I hope to have as much discussion as possible. Okay. So look, a lot has changed in the last 20 years regarding feminist theory. Although, of course, there are many continuities and the elaboration of ongoing questions that remain pressingly and sometimes depressingly the same. Although women remain secondary and subordinated to men in economic and political terms, indeed the economic disparity between the average wages of men and women is greater now than it was a decade ago. And the number of women who function as political leaders is now lower than it was a decade ago. It's also true that many new questions, issues and problems have emerged that were unrecognised or even non-existent 20 years ago. Religious fundamentalisms and terrorisms existed, but not as globally linked phenomena. Globalisation itself was a dream more than an economic reality. Queer theory had yet to emerge as such from its origins in lesbian and gay rights. Marxism and psychoanalytic theory, these are the moment in which our friendships were forged. Marxism and psychoanalytic theory represented ideal radical intellectual positions by which culturally variable relations could be analysed and understood in universally relevant terms. And class analysis, through its extension and reorientation, provided a model by which the position of women, colonised subjects, and indeed all social minorities could be recognised and analysed and their oppression integrated and understood on a single model. A lot has actually changed. But perhaps most strikingly, in terms of the generation of feminist theory, what has changed in the last 20 years is the development of women's and gender studies programs and departments, which have proliferated through universities and institutions of higher learning and have become relatively professionalised and institutionally incorporated. In many contexts, this means that feminist theory, that is the unique contribution of feminist programs and departments that needed to be added to their interdisciplinary focus. Feminist theory has become in many situations normalised, rendered into an entity, a knowable thing, surrounded by and aligned with history and methodology courses, even as it remains highly contested and without any agreed upon content, canonical texts, or named authors. Although, of course, there are, no doubt, common authors. Given that feminism has not succeeded in either of its competing or contradictory claims, that is, in either the creation of a genuine and thoroughgoing equality, which reveals the fundamental sameness of humanity underneath or beyond its morphological and representational variations, or the constitution of a genuine and practical autonomy, in which women choose for themselves how to define both themselves and the world, the ideal represented by the philosophy of sexual difference. It may now be time once again to raise the question, not of predicting what feminist theory will be, which is, I think, a depressing question, but rather the question what it could be, or maybe, let me be blunt, what it ought to be. My concern is not with extrapolating feminist theory as we know it today into the future. As we know, all of these projections about what the future will be are always the fantasy of the dominant interest of the present. And this is, by the way, why 1960s science fiction films are so fascinating about the 1960s. Instead of asking the question, what will feminist theory become in the future? How will it change? How will it remain the same? That is, instead of predicting what feminist theory will be, I want to address something that seems quite close, but is actually quite different. The question of what feminist theory could be, not what it will be. What my dream of a feminist future should be. So what is feminist theory at its best? That's really the question I want to ask. What is its continuing radical promise? How is it to be located relative to other fields of knowledge? Relative to the range and variety of interests of women, understood in all their differences? Relative to what remains unsaid, unspoken, and unrepresented in other knowledges? To what can feminist theory aspire? How can we produce knowledges, techniques, methods, and practices that bring out the best in ourselves, that enable us to overcome ourselves, that open us up to the embrace of the unknown and the open-ended future, that bring into existence new kinds of being, new kinds of subject, and new relations to objects? So that's the big question, and this is the question I hope that we keep asking with different answers. This is the question of the moment. Part one, concepts. My favourite topic. Only a nerd would say that. Not cakes, not food, but concepts. Cakes come close second though. So Foucault's conception of power as a series of forces that utilise whatever tactics it can, including the production of truth, is today a more accepted understanding of power than the pervasive concept of power as a form of falsehood or ideology that seemed to fascinate a previous generation of feminist theorists, or indeed myself in a previous moment. Knowledges are weapons, tools in the struggle of power over what counts as truth, over what can be used to create new systems, forces, regimes, techniques, none of which are indifferent to power. Now, this is not to say that those discourses aspiring to the status of truth and to be included in the canon of knowledge are not really true. I'm not suggesting that. But only that truth itself, which requires onerous conditions for statements to be included, is always already an effective power and a condition of power's more effective operation. Now, if Foucault concentrates on truth, particularly the kind of truth that is produced in what he calls the sciences of man, which I think we would understand as the humanities, the human sciences, within disciplines like psychology, sociology, criminology, economics, biology, and so on. Foucault never really addresses the field within which his own work is usually classified, what we generally call theory, or if we want to give it its proper name, philosophy. Dare we call it by its proper name? Not in the United States, where we just have to call it theory. It's a field that, if it relies on truth at all, requires a very different understanding of what truth is and how it functions. And indeed, it seems that Foucault was very embarrassed about being classified as a philosopher. And whenever philosophical answers were posed to the kind of political questions that he raised, he always chose a political solution rather than a philosophical one. And this, in part, I think, was the difference between him and Derrida and him and Deleuze. So Foucault doesn't really address those discourses that don't directly aspire to truth, but nonetheless aim to generate certain political, social, and cultural effects. In other words, he doesn't address theory or philosophy. And this is much more the concern of his contemporaries, Deleuze and Guattari, who asked the question, what is it to think? Which is another way of asking, what is philosophy? What is a concept? In addressing the question of what feminist theory is and what it could become, we need to understand first what theory is and what it might become. And for this, it seems to me that Deleuze and Guattari's work is, if not indispensable, then at least extremely useful. They enable us to understand, in keeping with something like Foucault's understanding of power and its investment in games of truth, that concepts, theories, are strategies, struggling among themselves with forces and effects that make a difference, that are significant beyond themselves, themselves, insofar as they become techniques by which we address the real, which, by the way, is a concept that we haven't talked about for a long time, and that I'd like to say many times, the real, the unmediated, undiscursive real. Okay? Concepts are about addressing the real directly. They're one way of addressing the real. I love that word. They're about addressing the ontology of reality, which is about force. So, in addressing the question of what feminist theory might be, we are primarily addressing the question of what it is to think differently, what it is to think innovatively, in terms that have never been developed before, about the most forceful and impressive impacts that impinge upon us. And thinking concepts and theories address these impacts, even if they never resolve or solve or answer them. So why do we need concepts? Because we live in a world we don't control. Okay, that's the simple answer. Concepts are one way of living with problems that are larger than our consciousness. And I want to suggest, along with Bergson, that we are, as humans, not the only ones who have concepts, even if we are the only ones who have philosophical concepts. And animals have concepts too. It's by certain concepts that animals address the impacts of the world as well. But we can talk about animals more tomorrow. Feminist theory at its best, and in its ideal form, is about generating new thought, new concepts, at least as much as, if not more than, about addressing or critiquing existing knowledges. It is not so much new truths that it wants to address. This is me in my Foucauldian mode. New truths which must meet onerous and normalising conditions in order to be part of the truth. So I'm not talking about new truths, I'm talking about new thinking. So we must ask, along with Deleuze and Guattari in their final collaborative text, What is Philosophy? We must ask, along with them, what is a concept? How is philosophy or theory, especially feminist theory, feminist philosophy, a practice that involves the production of concepts? Now, to simplify Deleuze and Guattari's position, we can say that in the beginning, I love this too, because this is the correlative of the real, in the beginning, as no structuralist ever said that phrase. In the beginning understood in evolutionary terms, meaning not a real beginning, but a mythical or phantasmatic beginning. In the beginning, there is chaos. My favourite concept, the real, chaos, ontology. There's chaos, there's the whirling force of materiality without limit, without boundary. Life emerges from chaos through chance, through the protraction of the past into the present, which is another word for memory. Life is the bringing of the past into the present. And what Darwin discovered was this extraordinary mechanism, which was the cell, a little boundary around chemicals, which allowed the preservation of the history of that cell to mark the present of that cell. And that's the first moment of life. So in the beginning, finally, after a long time, there is life. There's very, very, very simple life. And life, in some way here, is a response to the problem of chaos. How to preserve something of chaos for more than a moment. That's what life attempts initially to address. And this chaos, through life, produces the possibility of virtuality, or latency, or potential. And this is what adds to materiality the possibility of some order, or some consistency, which allows life to elaborate itself and to live. I don't know if that makes sense. Life extracts something regular. It produces perhaps something regular from this chaos to enable it to order chaos such that it can live. This is Darwin's discovery. I mean, it's a very simple idea. I've expressed it in quite a complicated way. This is Darwin's idea. It's random chance. And what survives is what randomly is able to protract the past into the present. And this protraction is what necessarily produces a surprise and the unexpected into a world of chaotic randomness. Now, natural selection selects from these randomly produced cells, those cells that produce the possibility of the extraction of some kind of order. Now, only when the evolutionary elaboration of life reaches a certain point of complexity, many billions of years after this cell, that concepts come to form as modes of generating order. Like, first of all, instincts do this. First of all, reflex reactions do this. But once life elaborates itself, once life develops a central nervous system, once it develops the possibility of a brain, once it develops the possibility of indetermination, concepts happen to be, randomly and by chance, one of the ways in which newness is capable of being invented to produce order. Concepts are one way in which the living address and attempt to deal with chaos. Now, notice I said attempt to deal with, I didn't say, in fact, control chaos, because there's no controlling chaos. The problem of life is how to live with chaos. And chaos is another word for the overabundance of order. It's not the absence of order, it's the overabundance of order which surrounds life. And concepts are one way in which life addresses chaos. Deleuze and Guattari also mention functions or scientific formula or extracting regularities. Empirical laws are another way of addressing chaos. And they suggest that percepts and affects, which make up the arts, are another way of addressing chaos. So these are three techniques. They're not the only three techniques, but these are three of the primary techniques by which human life addresses chaos. Functions, concepts, affects. These are modes from within that the living being deals with disorder from without. Darwin never knew what he was letting us in for. Concepts emerge. They have value and function only through the impact of problems. And problems are always generated from the outside, or from the real. Okay, a problem is only a problem because we can't flee it, because it doesn't come to us from within. The problem is always generated from the outside. And concepts are not solutions to problems, because most problems don't have a solution. Okay, isn't that refreshing to say that too? Most problems don't have a solution, and our task is not to solve them. Our task is to live with them, which is very different. There's no way to solve the problem of gravity, of living with others, of mortality. These don't have a solution. Sexual difference is another such problem. They don't have a solution. They just have endless experiments, ways of living. Concepts are the production of immaterial forces that line materiality with incorporeality. This is a Deleuzian concept, and it's really delicious. The material world is added to precisely by the production of a virtuality, which makes that materiality more than itself. What is this but the perspective that life brings on matter? Life lines the real with the possibility of being otherwise. And this is the endless potential of invention that life itself generates and that concepts elaborate. So concepts are the inner lining of materiality. Deleuze is not at all a materialist. He's someone who wants to bring together the problem of idealism with the problem of materialism. And what he wants to show is that although material forces are everywhere, they have the lining of the potential to be otherwise, which is a new schema, immanent in matter, that life illuminates in some way and life elaborates in some way. So this inner lining of materiality is the promise of a future different to the present. So concepts are ways in which the living add ideality to the world, transforming the givenness of chaos or the pressing problem into various forms of order, or into possibilities for being otherwise. Concepts are practices that we perform, not on things, but on events, to give them consistency, coherence, boundary, purpose, and use. Concepts do not solve problems that events generate. They enable us to surround ourselves with the possibility of being otherwise, that the direct impact of the event does not. We are struck by lightning, and what do? We hit on the spot and we die. Okay, that's the direct impact of an event. What a concept does is it surrounds that event with the possibility of us stepping aside, or of developing meteorology, which will allow us to forecast when the weather might be dangerous. Meteorology, by the way, the impossible science. For this very reason, the weather itself is a living organism in just the way that life is a kind of living organism. We can talk about that more later, especially here when the weather is so living, so dynamic, it changes everything. So concepts are not answers, they're not solutions. We tend to think that solutions eliminate the problem, when in fact, as Deleuze points out, problems always coexist with their solutions. Rather, concepts are modes of addressing problems, they're modes of connection. Deleuze calls them movable bridges between those forces which relentlessly impinge on us from the outside and those forces we can muster from within ourselves to transform the outside and to address these problems. And this is why concepts are created. This is why they have a date and often a name. They have a history that seizes hold of them in inconsistent ways, making use of new concepts with each seizure and transforming them through each new conquest, such that the concept itself is a weapon of struggle. Now, perhaps most interestingly, concepts cannot be identified, as far as Deleuze is concerned, with discourses or statements. This is his anti-Derridianism and his anti-structuralism. Concepts cannot be identified with discourses or with statements, which means that concepts can never be true. Truth is a relation between a proposition and the world, whereas concepts are never propositional because they never address states of affairs, but only events. Events are by definition problems that are unique and unrepeatable conjunctions of forces, and they require a response under peril of danger or death. Now, for Deleuze, one of the few mistakes of institutional philosophy is to collapse the concept into the proposition, to assert questions of truth instead of questions of force. And this is what Foucault, I think, has enabled us to see very clearly. So we need concepts in order to think our way in a world of forces that we don't control. Concepts are not a means of control, but a form of address that carves out for us a space and a time in which we may become what can respond to the indeterminate particularity of events. So concepts are thus ways of addressing the future, and in this sense are the condition under which a future different from the present, which by the way is the goal of every radical politics, becomes possible. Concepts are not premonitions, they're not ways of predicting what will be. On the contrary, they are modes of enactment of new forces. They are themselves the making of the new. The concept is what we produce when we need to address forces of the present and to transform them into new and different forces that are in the future. So the concept is indispensable for addressing the new, not through anticipation or forecasting, but through the task of opening up the real or the outside that the concept performs. The concept is thus the friend of all of those who seek radical social change, who seek new events and new alignments of forces. Deleuze has this idea of the philosopher as the friend of the concept. It's a really great thought. not as the friend of political activism, but as the friend of the concept, which itself indirectly performs politics by opening up the possibility of a new kind of future. The concept does not accompany radical or revolutionary change, because change has to be accomplished in its own terms, in the field or territory in which it functions. Rather, the concept renders change possible by adding these incorporeals to the force or weight of materiality. The concept is how living bodies, human bodies, that is male and female bodies of all types, protract themselves into materiality and enable materiality to affect and transform life. The concept is one way in which life attaches itself to forces imminent but undirected in the present. Along with the percept and the affect, the concept is how we welcome a people to come, the world to come, a movement beyond ourselves, rather than simply affirming what we are. In short, theory is never about us, about who we are. It only affirms what we can become, extracted as it is from events which move us beyond ourselves. If theory is conceptual in this Deleuzian sense, it is freed from representation. That is, from both senses of representation. It's freed from representing silent minorities that ideology inhibits. That is, it's free from representing subjects. And it's also free from representing the real through the truths it affirms. That is, it's free from representing objects. And thus it is opened up to the virtual, to the future that doesn't yet exist. Once concepts no longer have to represent, they're able to make. This is a wonderful liberation. Feminist theory is essential, not as a plan or anticipation of action to come. Feminist theory is essential as the anticipation of ideality or incorporeality. We need to add this incorporeality to the horrifying materiality of the present as patriarchal, racist, and ethnocentric. We need this ballast to enable the present to be transformed. So part 2 I've called force. It's not a concept, obviously, because I'm going to talk about the force of concepts. Feminist theory as the production of the concept relevant to understanding women, femininity, and the social subordination more generally, and of welcoming their transformation. Feminist theory is the production of new concepts, concepts outside, beyond, or at the very limit of those concepts that have defined men, women, and their relations up to now. Both patriarchal and feminist theory address, each in their different ways, an intractable, irreducible problem. The problem of sexual difference, which is the problem of morphological bifurcation, or in Darwinian terms, the problem of having two different types of body. And this is a problem not just we humans in each culture have to address, it's a problem that every form of animal life that is sexually bifurcated also has to address. It's the problem of two types of body and two different types of being, two different types of corporeality, and thus two different types of interest, value, and processes, who cannot without loss be understood or reduced to a single or universal form. Okay, Irigaray recognised this as the problem of sexual difference a long time ago. But what she affirms, in fact, is what Darwin understood without its political dimensions when he developed his work on sexual selection. And that is, sexual difference is an invention of life to maximise difference. Okay, sexual difference, the existence of two types of body, which are the body of mother and father, is an ingenious machinery that biology invented for maximising variation of difference. Irigaray, I asked Irigaray what she thought of Darwin, and she looked at me as if I was completely insane. Like, what would the connection between Darwin and her work possibly be? But in fact, even if she herself hasn't consciously made such a connection, I think the greatest confirmation of Irigaray's work is to be found precisely in the writings of Darwin, who makes it clear that sexual difference is an invention a brilliant invention of life that life will never undo. Life will never undo. Once sexual difference is introduced, the differences between the two sexes get further with each generation. Further and further and further apart. So sexual difference is iterative difference. The two sexes will never converge on a Darwinian model, but simply develop further and further apart. Something I was observing yesterday on the canals with the local ducks, who are diverging more and more in their colour schemes with each passing generation. Ducks and humans equally. So both patriarchy and feminist theory, each in their different ways, address this problem of sexual difference. This is a problem indeed that every society has to face, however small, whether human or animal. Sexual difference is an ongoing event that cannot be evaded, but for which there is no solution. How the two sexes are to coexist is a question that life itself, in its unpredictable variability, addresses in an ongoing way without universal solution. For it is one of the pressing frameworks, along with birth, illness and mortality, that every society must manage if it is to continue. Sexual difference is managed in two contrary ways, through patriarchal and through feminist conceptualizations. In patriarchy, the task is to ensure or guarantee the generational precedence of masculinity and male privilege, even as sexual difference each generation remains open-ended and to be resolved or lived through in various strategies. And for feminism, the task is to seek either a more equitable distribution of resources between men and women for liberal or Marxist feminists, or the possibility of a dual sexual symmetry entailed through an acknowledgement of sexual difference. Each is a contestatory relation. Patriarchy, as much as feminism, is a struggle that attempts to bind or unbind certain forces through the elaboration of concepts that highlight and singularize, specify and surround each of these forces. Both patriarchy and feminism struggle to generate concepts that bring into existence a future that serves its interests. Now, I don't want to suggest that there's any real parallelism between these two sets of concepts, or that they directly engage each other. Patriarchy clearly doesn't directly engage feminism, nor are they mutually defining. Patriarchy and feminism are not two protagonists in an evenly matched struggle, because feminism is the very excess and site of transformation of patriarchy itself. In other words, there's only patriarchy with its uneven eruptions, some of which we call feminist, and those eruptions are the excess of patriarchy attempting to undo itself through the force of the problem, which is sexual difference. So instead, their relations are more discontinuous, feminism and patriarchy. They're open-ended, each calling into existence its own constituencies, its own future peoples, its own landscape of events, without direct reference to the other. Feminist theory, whether patriarchal, racist, colonialist, or otherwise, is one means, certainly not the only means, by which we invent futures. It's one intense practice of production, like art, like economic production, like other kinds of labour, that makes things. Theory makes concepts that didn't exist before, that open up worlds to come. The production of concepts is by no means a privileged production. Indeed, we know within capitalism its value is absolutely minimal, which is why so little money is invested in the production of concepts by any government and by any culture. Like fashion is in fact far more invested in, and with good reason, than a single idea, or all of the ideas in the collective form. But it is nevertheless a necessary condition for the creation of new horizons of invention. Just as theory is by no means the only path to social change, but remains a necessary condition for the creation of new frameworks, new questions, new concepts, by which social change can move beyond the present. Although struggles at the level of practice are obviously crucial for the accomplishment of social change, without concepts which both face chaos and extract from it some uncontained force which provides us with a minimal order. Without this, we have no horizon for the new, no possibility of overcoming the weight of the present, no view of what might be, only the inertia of what is. Without concepts and without theory, practice has no hope. Its goal is only reversal and redistribution, not transformation. So part 3, I've hopefully called it the new. At its best, feminist theory is about the invention of new practices, new positions, new projects, new techniques, new values. Feminist theory must understand and address what is and has been in attempting to pre-apprehend and control what might come into being. And to that extent, feminist theory is committed to critique, that is, the process of demonstrating the contingency and transformability of the present. But there also needs to be the production of alternatives to patriarchal, racist, colonialist, ethnocentric knowledges. And, more urgently and less recognised, there needs to be a freedom to address, to make and transform concepts, so that we may invent new ways of opening up the real, new types of subjectivity, new relations between subjects and objects. Now this is very vague, I've been very vague up till now. I'll try and be a little more concrete, although it's rare for philosophy to be empirical at all. I'll just dip my toe into the empirical world a little bit. I don't really want to suggest that there are these major problem areas, but I do want to suggest that there are at least 3 or 4 major issues that govern feminist theory in the present that would be really good to move beyond. This is probably where I got into trouble last time. I really don't want to suggest that these 4 positions that I'm going to outline are useless. On the contrary, I think they were immensely historically important. But I think that they've now become governing areas within feminist theory that it would be really good for us to leave space so that alternatives could also be developed. So I'll say this very quickly. I think it would be really good to displace these 4 issues in favour of other issues. This is linked, she says even more nervously, to the proliferation of memoirs, the overwhelming emphasis on the personal, the anecdotal, and the rational, which, while important for many long periods of feminism's existence, now seem to have shown us the limit of feminist theory in the present. To the extent that feminist theory focuses on questions of the subject or identity, it thereby leaves questions about the rest of existence untouched. Feminism abdicates the right to speak about the real, about the world, about matter, about nature, and in exchange cages itself into the regime of I, who I am, who recognises me, what I can become. And ironically, this demand to be recognised is increasingly the global right to define oneself to a specific mode of consumption. To define who one is the right for the subject to own and to become a specific type of subject. Now, this focus on the primacy of the subject has obscured 2 issues. The one relates to what constitutes the subject that the subject cannot know about itself. And this is an insight that to some extent we've gained from psychoanalysis, but it goes beyond a psychoanalytic understanding. In other words, we need to ask the question of what the limit of the subject's subjectivity is, and what the content and nature of the agency or agencies that we attribute to the subject. So that's my first anxiety. And for me, the problem is never the problem, where is agency? This is the most ridiculous of problems. There's agency everywhere. The problem is, I have too many agencies in me. The problem isn't, am I an agent? I'm obviously an agent. The problem is, which agent am I? Given that I have conflicting agencies in myself, such that each issue for me is an ambiguity and a complexity. What do I want? I want conflicting things. Is this a good or a bad thing? This is the condition of being a subject. Okay, am I this thing? I'm always more than this thing because I'm a conflicting set of agencies. And the problem is there are too many agencies in the modern life. It's not that I lack agency, I have too much. And the problem is that in contemporary culture this is reduced to the capacity to consume rather than the capacity to make. So the subject does not make itself, and the subject does not know itself. The subject seeks to be known and to be recognised, but it is only through its reliance on others, including the very others who collectively subjugate the subject, that the subject needs recognition from. This is, by the way, my critique of Julie Popper's position. You want recognition from who? You mean the heterosexual subject who has cast you out to begin with? You want to show them that their gender is constructed? Why would you bother? That's the simple response. Why would you bother to give them the truth about your constructiveness? What help would that be, given they've subjugated you in the first place? Okay, so that's part of the critique of the problem of recognition. Recognition is a servile demand. Recognition puts myself in the hands of the other. I do this voluntarily when I seek to be recognised. My response is, screw recognition. Seriously. We need to ask with more urgency now than in the past. If what the subject strives to be recognised by as a subject of value in a culture doesn't value that subject to begin with, what is that recognition worth? And the answer is absolutely nothing. And once the subject is recognised, what is created through this recognition? To focus on the subject at the cost of focusing on the forces that make up the world, we lose the capacity to see beyond the subject. We lose the capacity to engage with the world, to make the real. We wait to be recognised instead of making something or inventing something which will enable us to recognise ourselves. And more interestingly, to abandon recognition altogether. So I am not what others see in me. I am what I do and what I make. I become according to what I do, not who I am. And this is not to ignore the very real differences between subjects and their social positions, but only to suggest that these differences are not the subjectivities between which these differences are distributed, are the vehicles for the new. It's difference that is the engine of newness, not the subjects who anchor this difference in the modality of sameness. So let me make it explicit. It is the inhuman work of difference, rather than its embodiment in human identity, subjectivity, or consciousness, that is reflected in and through identity that interests me now. I'm more interested in those differences that make us more than we are, recognisable perhaps for a moment in our path of becoming, but never fixed in terms of how we can be read by others, or how we classify ourselves, never the basis of an identity or a position. Instead of seeing difference as the external and preconfigurable relation between two distinct objects, difference itself must be considered primordial. Difference itself is a non-reciprocal emergence which underlies and makes possible all different identities. Now, I've got an extraordinary and wonderful quote from Deleuze. It's the only quote in my paper. It's very brief. And in it, he compares the idea of difference to an identity which produces itself. It's a fantastic metaphor. It's one of the great metaphors. He says, instead of something distinguishing from something else, imagine something that distinguishes itself, and yet that from which it distinguishes itself does not distinguish itself from it. Lightning, for example, fantastic metaphor. Lightning, for example, distinguishes itself from the black of the sky, but must also trail it behind, as though it were distinguishing itself from that which doesn't distinguish itself from it. So the blackness of the sky doesn't distinguish itself from lightning. It is lightning that is a self-emergence from the blackness of the sky. That's a fantastic metaphor for the concept of an identity. What is an identity? That which differentiates itself and produces itself in this movement of self-differentiation without regard for another, without another having the power to transform that process of self-differentiation. This is what difference entails, not the other, but self-differentiation. Difference is the point at which determination, or the lightning, meets the undetermined, the black sky. This difference in itself is continually subjected to restructurings and reorientations through being identified with entities or things. But whatever identity there may be, lightning has the most provisional and temporary form. Difference is that movement of self-differentiation, that movement of internal differentiation that separates itself from the difference that surrounds it. Difference produces its own differentiations from the undifferentiated. So to think of an identity like lightning, this lighting up, this self-elaboration, however provisional and temporary it is, this is a really exciting idea because it involves the black sky. It doesn't involve just lightning being lightning. To be lightning, there must be a black sky, there must be an outside. Point 2. Linked to the preeminence of the subject is the privilege of epistemology. That is, questions of discourse, knowledge, truth and scientificity have been privileged for at least 100 years now over the ontological, which are questions of the real, questions of matter, of force or energy. Indeed, in 2011, it'll be exactly 100 years since Bertrand Russell's devastating critique of the writings of Bergson, which made clear the overshadowing of the ontological and the metaphysical by the epistemological. It's a really appropriate moment now to anticipate the rise of the ontological once again. Epistemology is the field of what we as knowing subjects, as suitably qualified knowing subjects, can know of the objects we investigate, including those objects who are themselves subjects. Thus it makes sense that in a politics of intellectual struggle, epistemological questions have prevailed and have come to displace or cover over ontological questions. The whole of 20th century thought has followed this trajectory, the translation of metaphysical questions about the real into epistemological questions about the true. And this is also a translation of the categories relevant for the object into those concerned with the subject. Feminist theory needs to turn again to questions of the real, not simply empirical questions, although of course I have nothing against them. I don't deal with them myself very much, but I'm happy for others to deal with them. So not simply empirical questions regarding states of affairs. States of affairs are still an epistemological concept, but questions about the nature and forces of the real, the nature and forces of the world, cosmological and historical forces. Indeed, it needs to welcome again what epistemologies have left out, which is the relentless force of the real. This means that instead of a further submersion in the politics of representation, in which the real can only ever be addressed through the lens imposed on it by representation in general and by language in particular, where ontology is always mediated by epistemology, we need to reconsider representational forces in their impact on the real. We need to reconceptualize the real as forces or energies or events, things that impact both before and beyond representation. This is, I know, heretical in certain circles. People have spent 30 years making it clear that everything's mediated by representation. Well, I'm going to suggest that representation itself is produced by the forces of the real. So this opens us up to a whole series of new questions and new objects for feminist interrogation. Not just social systems now, but also natural systems. Not just concrete relations between real things, but relations between forces and fields. Not just economic, linguistic and cultural analysis, but also biological, chemical and physical analysis. Not just relations between the past and the present, but also relations between the present and the future. Point 3, almost at the end. Tied in with these 2 points, feminist theory needs to affirm, rather than the subject and what it knows, and the cultural, which constitutes, defines and limits this subject, Feminism needs to address, as my illustrious colleague Rosie has done in much of her work, the question of the inhuman in all its rich resonances. And this question of the inhuman is another way of asking the question of difference. The concept of difference, ironically, does link together various categories of subject, various types of identity, all of the human, but not through the elaboration of a shared identity, but through a common variation or difference that the human in all its modalities asserts from the inhuman. Both the subhuman, which is the material organic world, and the superhuman, which is the cultural, the collective, the cosmic, and the supernatural. This perspective, which inserts the cultural and political life in the interstices between two orders of the inhuman, the pre-personal and the impersonal. This, I think, provides a new framework and connection, a new kind of liberation for the subject, who understands that culture and history have an outside, that culture and history are framed and given a position only through orders of difference that structure the material world. So a future feminism needs to place the problematic of sexual difference, which is, I think, the most fundamental concern of feminist theory, in the context of both animal becomings, because we've tended to oppose culture to nature and to see culture as variable and nature as fixed. So we need to see that connection. And we need to see the context of animal becomings in relation to the becomings microscopic and imperceptible that regulate matter itself. Sexual difference, which is the division of life into two biologically different types of body, two different types of reproduction, two relations of sexuality and pleasure, two relations of being and knowing, not only defines our culture's way of regulating subjects, it is also the way the natural world has generated a mechanism for producing endless difference. Sexual difference is the invention not of culture, but of life, which humans have inherited from a prehistoric animal past, and a past which is not dead, but lives within us here and now. And we have devoted much effort to the social, cultural, representational, historical, and national variations of human relations. We now need to develop a more complex and sophisticated understanding of the ways in which natural forces, both living and non-living, frame, enrich, and complicate our understanding of the subject, its interior, and what the subject can know. In other words, feminism needs to direct itself to questions of complexity, emergence, and difference that the study of subjectivity shares in common with the study of chemical and biological phenomena. I never thought I'd hear myself saying that, but here it is out of my own mouth. We need to understand in more explicit terms newness, change, and the unpredictable. How these are generated both above and below the level of the social, in order to explain the complex movements of social and political life. These are no longer the concern only of cosmologists and physicists, but also those committed to social and political change. And finally, last, but by no means least, number 4, perhaps the very notion of separate forms or types of oppression, or the notion of various forms of oppression as recognisable, systematic and overlapping structures need to be reconsidered. I certainly don't want to suggest that there's no such thing as oppression, but I would like us to reconsider the terms by which oppression is commonly understood. Oppression is made up of a myriad of acts, large and small, individual and collective, private and public. Patriarchy, racism, classism, ethnocentrism are all the names we give to characterise a pattern among these acts, a discernible form among these acts. Now, I'm not suggesting that patriarchy or racism don't exist. I'm really not suggesting they don't exist, and I'm not suggesting they don't have mutually inducing effects on individuals. I'm just suggesting that they're not structures and they're not systems. I think they're immanent patterns. They're models we impose on a plethora of acts to generate some order. Now, what exists are these teeming multiplicity of acts, big acts, little acts, systematic acts, asystematic acts, acts of families, of sexual couples, of institutions, and the very particular relations they establish between experts and their objects of investigation. We have here in this classroom the acts of teachers and the acts of students. In the hospital we have the acts of doctors and of patients, of migrants and those who belong to and rooted to a nation. Patriarchy, racism and classism are labels we attach for the sake of convenience as a form of shorthand to describe this multiplicity of acts that we believe are somehow systematically connected. So what I'm going to say makes me very nervous, but I'll say it anyway. There is no self-contained system of patriarchy that is capable of being connected to a self-contained system that is called racism, to form such a thing as an intersectional oppression. There are only a multiplicity of acts, big and small, significant and insignificant. If we understand this multiplicity configures in unique ways for each individual, yet enables shared patterns to be discerned for those who share certain social positions, then we will not confuse these acts for a latent order, or worse, for a coercive system. Instead, we will be able to see not just how socially marginalised groups are discriminated against, but the agency and inventiveness, the positive productivity that even the most socially marginalised subjects develop or invent through the movements they utilise and the techniques that even marginalised subjects can utilise to enable them to develop. The acts that constitute oppression are also the condition under which other kinds of invention and other kinds of acts become possible. Perhaps there are only differences, incalculable and interminable differences for us to address. Perhaps, and this is my wild idea, there is no system, there are no identities, there are no intersections, there are just multiplying forces of difference. I believe that race, class, gender and sexuality, although they appear static categories and are of course capable of conceptually freezing themselves in order for various definitions for various purposes, I believe that these are precisely such differences that cannot be determined in advance. What it means, for example, for a poverty-stricken woman in Sri Lanka, or a working-class lesbian in Japan, or a single mother in Nigeria, remains to be determined, and it is wishful thinking on the part of the analyst or the activist to believe that these differences can be represented by first-person voices or measured by any objective schema, because no voice ever represents a group, a category or a people without dissent. And no categories are so clear-cut and unambiguous that they can be applied willy-nilly without respect to the specific objects of their investigation. So these questions, who are you? What is this category of subject? How do these oppressions interlock? These are open-ended and they have to be negotiated by each individual, each generation and each geography in its own unpredictable terms. So I dream of a feminist future in which theory no longer looks inward to affirm our positions, our experiences, our beliefs, but looks outward to the world, to what we don't control or understand, in order to expand, not confirm, what we know, what we are, and what we feel. Feminist theory can become a provocation to think otherwise, to become otherwise. Feminist theory can be a process of humbling the pretensions of consciousness to knowledge and mastery, and a spur to stimulate a process of opening oneself up to the otherness that is the world itself. At its best, feminist theory has the potential to make us become other than ourselves, to make us become unrecognizable. Thank you.